we are really grateful to have Jacob Haas joining us tonight. He is a research specialist from Matthew Desmond's Eviction Lab. And Eviction Lab is mainly focused on collecting data and doing research around people being evicted during the COVID-19 pandemic. And before I give too much more of his introduction away, I will hand it over to Jacob and welcome you on behalf of all of us, Jacob.
Great. Thanks so much, Peg. And thanks to Wes and you for having me on. I'm so excited to talk to you all. I know Matt is so excited to have groups like yours reading his book and engaging with his thoughts and material. So as Peg mentioned, my name is Jacob Haas. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a research specialist at the Eviction Lab. I've been with the Eviction Lab for about 3 years now, contributing to our data and research initiatives. I'm coming to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan, I should say. So go blue. Um, so at the Eviction Lab, we are a data and research team. We're dedicated to tracking and producing research on evictions, housing insecurity, affordable housing in general, any kind of those issues in the United States. We have a few different data sets that are publicly available that you can go to our website and explore, that kind of give the lay of the land on, what's happening with evictions, how many families are affected by evictions each year. This work was spurred out of Matt's prior book, his book Evicted, which came out several years ago at this point. And I contribute to a lot of the data and research kind of work behind the Eviction Lab. I was also a research assistant on the book Poverty by America. And so, the book is near and dear to my heart as well. And so I'm grateful for you all having me and for engaging with the work.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peg. Peg's going to start us off with our first question for Jacob. But if you have any questions about Eviction Lab and the work that Jacob has done, or, Eviction Lab as a collective, please put those in the chat and we'll try to get to them as many as possible in the next 40-ish minutes. So Peg, start us off.
Okay, so Jacob, I have kind of a multi-pronged question. So I instead of giving you all of them at one time, I'll just kind of ask one by one. So if you could just tell us, what are some of your primary sources of data? And I guess the second part of that would be, is most of it provided by municipalities or the federal government, or is it independently collected by your organization?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's a great question. And I guess I should zoom out and say that the reason we at the Eviction Lab, we started gathering and tracking data on evictions is because there was a lack of eviction data in the United States prior. So, the federal government doesn't collect nationwide data on eviction rates, on eviction filing rates across the country. So, when Matt was researching his last book, Evicted, there was still kind of this big question of how many families get evicted from their homes each year, how many families are forcibly displaced. And that's not something that the federal government had the data quite to answer at that point. And so he started our team, the Eviction Lab, as a group that would hopefully answer that question. And in terms of the data that we have, it comes from a variety of sources. So we use data gathered directly from court systems who produce these records and will sometimes put them together and send them directly to us in bulk files. We also gather data from other sources like LexisNexis, who also as kind of a company gathers data. We take that data in. The third way that we've started to gather eviction data is by going to court websites, and along with some of our partner organizations across the country, in Dallas, in Nashville, they or we have started using data scraping to go through court records and court forms and scrape how many court cases were filed against folks facing eviction each month and each year. We then kind of take all that data in, we process it, we clean it, because data is, very messy for any of you that work with data. And we're able to use very interesting statistical models to estimate how many eviction cases were filed or enacted in areas where we don't get data, where we can't get court data, where we can't get any other sources. So kind of the end result of all of that are that we have been able to estimate at the Eviction Lab that there are an average of about 3.6 million eviction cases filed against US households in a given year. And it's kind of a staggering number. And that also we focus on, court cases that we can see, formal court filings. There's a whole host of other forms of displacement outside of the formal court system, whether that's a family who had the locks illegally changed or their door taken off the hinges, or were threatened with an eviction, or whether that's just someone who at the end of a lease had a steep rent increase and had to move out. So that's kind of the overview of what we as a lab do, what we as a team do in terms of data collection and processing.
And on your eviction map, Jacob, could you speak a little bit about what is the difference between modeled data and original data?
Absolutely. Yeah. So our model data is, like I mentioned before, we have some statistical models kind of working in the background to estimate eviction activity in the areas where we're not able to collect data. There's a lot of court systems that they're still relying on paper and pen court records, or they don't have everything centralized, or they just don't release their data to a group like ours. In those places, we use a bunch of statistical estimates based on other factors to estimate how much eviction is going on in those areas, how many families are facing eviction. That's kind of what the model data entails. The original data is it doesn't use any of those statistical estimates. It's using our methods from a prior release of our data set. And that's kind of, if you want to explore a little bit more, there's a couple benefits to the original data. The first and foremost is that in some areas, you can actually zoom down not only to like a county, but you can zoom down really, really far down to your neighborhood, your city, certain, granularities that you can't get in other data sets. So if those are areas, if you live in an area where we have good data, where we have data, from a court system, and we've been able to track and verify that data, and you scroll over to our original data set, oftentimes that can get you, really granular data in your area on how many families are facing eviction in a given year.
I was exploring, sorry, Peg, I was exploring the website, and so I was like, and then I was like, oh, there's a pause. So
I know, I was just going to add, it's just astounding. I mean, and kind of like the sidestep with a quick question, Jacob, does that data ever shock and surprise you?
It's kind of astounding how many people, even just formal court-ordered evictions, affects every year. Like I said, there's 3.6 million eviction cases filed every year. And that was, that data, it's not just during the Great Recession, it's not just during COVID. This was happening even in, even when economic times were relatively good in 2016, 2017, 2018. A lot of families struggle and face housing insecurity even in the best of times in the country. And it's pretty astounding that this is really just looking at a subsection of how many families face housing insecurity every year. A lot of families don't, they don't wait for a court they don't wait for a court case, frankly, to leave their homes. They wait for a sheriff to show up knocking on their door. A lot of times the landlord will, threaten or post an eviction notice on someone's door, and they'll leave that first notice. They'll leave after a rent increase. So it's pretty astounding to see not only the breadth of how often housing insecurity faces Americans in a given year, but also that it really affects everyone. This isn't just a crisis in our core, metropolitan urban areas. This isn't just something that happens, in New York City and in San Francisco. This is happening across the country. It's happening in neighborhoods that are urban, suburban, rural. And so I say that, but I guess it's more on the flip side, eviction is it's a process that's really highly concentrated, both within specific neighborhoods and specific buildings. A lot of landlords don't evict year after year, and it's very often, the top filing or the top evicting landlords that really drive eviction activity in a given area in a given year. But eviction activity is really highly concentrated within lower income neighborhoods. It's very highly concentrated within neighborhoods where a majority of renters are Black. And eviction is something that proportionally affects women, and women, especially women with young children. Landlords file disproportionately often for eviction against renters who have young children in their households.
Well, I appreciate that insight, because you kind of touched on Susan's question, who asked, who does get evicted, and so I appreciate that. And you brought COVID up in your example that eviction wasn't just an issue in America, since the pandemic outbreak, but how did the COVID pandemic affect evictions within our country?
It affected a lot is the short answer. COVID changed a lot about how housing instability and what that means and what that looks like in the country. So when COVID first broke out in early 2020, people had a lot of job losses, people lost loved ones. But there was really this huge worry that a lot of people would lose their homes too, in the sense that, if people were losing their jobs, they would fall behind on rent, and they would be out kind of on the street or doubling up with other relatives or family members or friends, at a time when, the whole narrative, if you remember, was kind of to keep people in their houses, to keep people, at home. And so we at the Eviction Lab, I've been talking kind of about our nationwide historical data. We realized we weren't going fast enough. We realized we needed to be more, on the nose and in real time about what we were seeing and how we were tracking our data. And so or I should say, one of our research fellows, now our associate director, Peter Hepburn, also a professor at Rutgers Newark, along with another research specialist, Renee Louis, they did the eviction tracking system, which is it's a collaborative project where a lot of other organizations and individuals are involved in this project, that it wouldn't have been possible without. But this is a project, the eviction tracking system, where we in real time, week after week, month after month, are combing through court records and trying to figure out how many eviction cases are filed in real time in several states and cities across the country. We've been able to do this now. We've been able to expand this data collect mechanism to about a third of renters nationwide. So, we have a whole lot of renters collected in this data. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that eviction activity dropped during the depth of the pandemic. People, stayed, in terms of formal eviction activity, people stayed in their homes. And a lot of that is due to state, local, and federal protections that were in place during the depths of the pandemic. You might have heard about the federal eviction moratorium. but there were also state and local protections that were in place and, keeping people out of the formal court system and in their homes. And so in April 2020, when COVID was really kind of this big, scary unknown, eviction filing records were at about 10% of their historical averages, which is, that's not something you see during a normal economic and public health crisis. And eviction filings, they bumped up as courts were reopening slightly. But state, local, and federal protections kept filings well below historical averages well into 2020. And as emergency rental assistance started being doled out in 2021, on the order of, tens of billions of dollars nationwide, eviction filings stayed generally below historical averages, which is pretty astounding, given that, we faced a lot of people lost their jobs. I mean, this was a big it's a big deal, that this was happening. A big success in a lot of ways, that people were staying in their homes and were able to keep their homes. That being said, what we've seen as protections have expired, as we get into 2022, 2023, and then at the start of this year, is kind of a slow trickle, step-by-step increase back towards his pre-pandemic levels. In some areas, especially in certain cities and states, in particular Houston, Las Vegas, Minneapolis, in certain areas, we've seen eviction activity go beyond pre-pandemic levels.
Appreciate it. So, outside of the start of this virtual book club, another positive COVID is eviction numbers went down. So, all right. Peg's
Well,
got our next.
thanks. Jacob, is Eviction Lab partnering with other organizations, for example, the Poor People's Campaign, to push for legislation for rent increase protections and other initiatives?
Yeah, so we at the Eviction Lab, we're a 501c nonprofit. We're fairly heavily focused as a team on kind of bearing witness to what's happening and producing really rigorous research and data, publicly available data on these issues. But Matthew, as as a person and in writing this book, Poor People's Campaign, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's Reverend Barber's organization. I know that Matt has is a frequent collaborator and has spoken with Reverend Barber, and Matt has testified in the Senate for various reasons. He's kind of as a person doing a lot of that work. I'll also say that, and this is something I was I wanted to get to at some point, so maybe this is a good point. But as a part of the process of writing this book, Matt created this website called endpovertyusa.org, which website I don't know if you want to link to, or I can just link to it. But this is a website where if you want to get involved in working on issues related to poverty in your local area, this is a website where you can kind of come through the organizations on a day-to-day basis working at these issues, and the different organizations kind of working at this day in and day out to try and solve these issues around housing, around health, education, kind of name. Yeah, there's a lot of great organizations on that website that are doing really great work.
And thank you. I know you mentioned before that, evictions don't have a certain demographic per se, nor do they have a certain geographical location. But do you find that there is some data that kind of spikes up higher for certain segments of people in certain areas of the country, or it really is just kind of all pervasive?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So eviction is something that affects kind of all areas around the country, but there are certainly areas and there are certainly communities that really face the brunt of eviction at a much higher rate. One group is renters of color. Black renters face much higher eviction rates and eviction filing rates than white renters. And that was true even during the pandemic. We have some research out that shows that during the pandemic, eviction filing activity was reduced kind of across racial and demographic lines, but even during the depths of the pandemic, even when eviction filings were at their lowest and protections were at their highest, it was still Black renters, and especially Black female renters, that were getting eviction cases filed against them by property owners at the highest rates. The other thing I'll mention is that we at the Eviction Lab, we've had a really great partnership with the Census Bureau, where we've been able to, some researchers on our team have been able to combine our eviction records that we've compiled with census records, from the decennial census, to get a sense of who's actually at most risk when we're talking about eviction. And what we found is that it's young children. It's young children that are really disproportionately affected by eviction. And that's obviously a cause of alarm, but it's, eviction has been linked to a whole host of adverse physical and mental health outcomes. And so when you're talking about children, this is something that affects the rest of their lives. I mentioned kind of this is an issue that affects all corners of the country, but it does affect certain places in different ways. Someone living in rural North Carolina will be affected by housing insecurity in a different way than someone living in New York, both in the sense of states have very different legal regimes. When you go into a housing court, it's very different what you'll see in Baltimore, Maryland versus Sacramento, California. It's very different the amount of notice you'll be given. It's very different kind of how the process gets unfolded. But it's also different, if you're living in an area with a lot of social support versus an area where that might not necessarily be the case. So this is something that affects a lot of people, and it affects people in very different ways across the country.
Appreciate that. I really I'm checking out this inpovertyusa.org that Robin did put in the chat, and we'll be sure to put it. It's really neat to, I clicked on Nebraska and seeing the various resources, and was proud to see some organizations that I know. So really a robust resource. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
So, we are a grassroots organization, and we know that a big way to see change is we have to see change in policy. Policy change is what brings about true positive results. And so could you speak to, whether it's a municipality or a county or state, or if maybe the federal government has done something great, what's some sound policy or initiatives that you're aware of that could give inspiration for us across the country to encourage our levels of government to take a look at and replicate?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing that I'll note on this is that there's no reason why there should be this much housing instability and eviction in the country. It's not the case in countries like Canada, across the ocean in Europe, the UK. Other countries have much lower eviction activity rates than in the US. So there's no reason for housing instability to be this big of an issue in the country. And one of the other things that's come about in recent years since the depths of the pandemic is that there's been a lot of innovation with cities, states, courts, sheriff's offices, and grassroots organizations like yours, kind of taking housing instability, housing affordability, and eviction very seriously as an issue, and kind of taking steps to hopefully combat high rates of displacement in their area. So some examples I can point to, if anyone's kind of in the Philadelphia area, they'll know that Philadelphia has implemented this very wide-reaching eviction diversion program, an eviction mediation program, where folks that are facing eviction, they can be diverted out of the formal court system and into kind of a mediated agreement with their landlord. Eviction is something that follows people around if it's on your record, and makes it a lot harder in a lot of cases to find future housing. Mediation programs can be a really big win-win, both for a landlord and a tenant, to kind of reach some kind of agreement, some kind of settlement. And they can be a win for court systems too, who have found a lot of court cases have to kind of by necessity churn cases in and churn cases out. Other things that I'll note are, when you talk about what affects eviction rates and eviction filing rates across the country, a lot of it's procedural. High rents obviously really affect things. Poverty, race, these are all very important factors when you're talking about eviction and housing. But even just like the procedural quirks in a state really affect things. So an example of this is an eviction filing fee. And this is the fee that a landlord will pay a court to file for an eviction. It's higher in some states than others. And when I say higher in some states, I mean, a few $100 in some states to down around $15, $20 in certain areas. And when there's, not really a barrier for a landlord to file an eviction, eviction rates and eviction filing rates really go much higher. Another thing is eviction notices. So in some states, tenants are given 3 days, 3 notice before an eviction case is filed against them. In some states, an eviction case is filed at the same time a notice is delivered. But in other states, they'll give tenants a week. They'll give tenants much longer to catch up on their rent and cure their violation. This can make a really big impact in terms of letting families catch up and keeping landlords from using the court system as kind of a rent collection mechanism. I'm talking kind of a little nitty gritty, but there's kind of a bigger scope here, which is a lot of cities and states, I think, have really realized the depth of the affordable housing issue in their areas. And that, that's really underlying a lot of this. It's just kind of really the lack of affordable housing in this country. And that's a much bigger issue, but it's something that, it's nice to see a lot of folks care about.
Thank you, Jacob. I want to ask if Eviction Lab has held any congressional hearings, or other stakeholders have had any congressional hearings. I'm reading something from in our chat. One of our attendees has this question. In terms of policy changes or legislative impact, and how can we help as individuals?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, there's a lot of really great organizations outside of ours that are doing a lot of the legwork to try and tackle the big issues, the issues of housing affordability, affordable housing supply, tenant protections, tenant rights. Organizations like the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Policy Link are really great national organizations, down to much more local organizations, whether that's more kind of whether that's more like on the lobbying side or more on the grassroots side of. There's a group in Kansas City, for example, Casey Tenants, that really hammers their local groups hard on trying to keep tenants protected. So there's a lot of really great groups that are organizing and trying to get good policy going. Matt Desmond has spoken at Senate Senate hearings about issues surrounding housing. And I think someone just linked to that in the chat, which is great. And I guess to your second question on, what can grassroots groups like yours do? I think a lot of it seems like you're already doing in terms of caring about these issues and engaging. I think there's another there's a lot of organizations kind of at the local level that again are doing this great, and that we've kind of been able to hopefully catalog on our endpovertyusa.org website. I think there's the kinds of two levels of engagement, the local and then kind of the federal policy level, where things kind of move slowly, but a lot of the important change has to happen. And then there's kind of the personal level where I think Matt talks about this in Poverty by America a lot, where a lot of the issues facing poor people in the country are issues like housing segregation, and the big walls that are in people's faces when they try to move to better opportunity. These are all issues that really affect people, and should be cared about.
Appreciate that. And I found some of those links, and Robin does a great job of doing some more additional research. So heads up, we're nearing that last 5-10 minutes. So if you have some additional questions, be sure to place those into the chat. And so I believe Cynthia asked the question, and kind of combining Jamel's as well. So if you were looking to move, what are the top 3 states for sure to avoid? And then, areas of the country that are housing friendly, eviction friendly.
Sure. Yeah. So oh man, that's a question to answer. I think there's a lot of things that would go into someone choosing to move to a place. But in terms of the landlord-tenant laws in specific states and specific areas, I guess I'll just point to a few where we've kind of looked at why certain places have higher eviction filing rates or eviction rates than others. So if you take a look, if any of you get the chance to take a look at our national map, something you'll see is that there are certain states where eviction filing rates kind of jump off the charts. It's kind of astounding how many eviction cases are filed. There are states like Maryland, South Carolina, where eviction filings are filed in greater proportions than other areas. A lot of that has to do with procedural issues. So in Maryland, there was the process was such that an eviction case was filed very early on in the process, and so kind of by nature there were more eviction filings, there were more eviction cases filed, more families that had an eviction filing on their record. That's since been amended in 2021 with great news. But there are areas that you'll notice like South Carolina, they also kind of have these legal mechanisms where there's a lot of eviction filings in those areas. Other states, other states have their own quirks. I don't want to judge certain areas over another, but it's kind of a measure of certain states have certain quirks in them that make things a lot harder for renters. Florida, for example, has something that locals will refer to as a pay-to-play process, where you have to, in order to even get a court case, a date on the docket for your court to have your day in court, if you're a renter, you have to pay the back rent that you owe. So if a renter is has some kind of issue with their landlord where they were, say, withholding rent in a certain way, and they were filed against for eviction, maybe they were withholding rent because of some maintenance issues or inhabitability issues, they might not get their day in court unless they can cure that rent violation. So there's I could point to other states, Missouri, Nevada, that have their own quirks that, make things harder for renters. There are also certain subsections of renters, or I guess I should even say homeowners. West in your area in Omaha, in Nebraska, for example, there's a lot of residents of manufactured home communities, or more commonly known as mobile home parks, that can face steep rent increases on their lot rents where they own their home, but maybe not the lot of rent, the lot that they're renting underneath. They can face eviction and housing instability even though they're owners, at fairly high rates. So there's a lot of issues in a lot of different areas, a lot of times due to certain procedural quirks, that make things harder for renters than they may necessarily have to be.
I appreciate.
Thank you.
Yeah, I never thought of the mobile home lot fees and that side of it. So yeah. And I know like one thing here in Omaha that we struggle with, and I think I shared the um last week was we have a lot of out-of-state folks coming in and buying the rental houses, predominantly in low-income Black neighborhoods, and so all they care about is money, and that has really hurt. So appreciate that. Well, so we're at that 45-minute mark, and I want to honor your time, but and we didn't really chat about this too much prior to get launching our conversation tonight, but why have you chosen to do work with Eviction Lab? Like, what about this topic and this work and the research and data collection and whatnot? Like, what made you choose this area or focus?
Yeah, so I came in with kind of an economics and data background to this work, and I was inspired by Matt's prior work with his book Evicted. And I found it really compelling and disheartening the extent to which, you know, households with children, regular households all across the country were facing housing instability and housing issues. And Matt talks about his personal journey a little bit in his current book. Um, it's such a big issue, housing. Rent eats such a big proportion of people's incomes every month. The majority of people in the country are spending over 30% of their incomes on rent. A lot of people are spending over half their incomes on rent. This is a really big issue, and it's keeping a lot of people down, and it's keeping a lot of people from achieving what they could be achieving. And the extent to which, I come in with kind of a number crunching background, the extent to which I can kind of put that information out there and get that under the eyes of folks is something that I'm very happy to do and very proud to do.
Well, we're thankful that you and Matthew and many others at your team are passionate about making sure that one, this data is available, and then two, that we can take this data and easily share it to alert others on the need to truly address these this huge issue. But even though it's huge, it's easily one we can solve if we are willing to do it. And so appreciate that. And, Jamel asked, does Eviction Lab have internship opportunities or, employment opportunities, or how are other ways we can engage with Eviction Lab and the work that you all do?
We do take interns every once in a while if that's something you're interested in. Yeah, keep an eye out.
And then we'll share out the social media and whatnot. But truly all, if you just spend 5-10 minutes perusing the website, you're going to come away with great information. And then of course we can't forget the endpovertyusa.org one as well. So thank you, Jacob, for your work and being dedicated to this important endeavor. And we really do appreciate you taking time to share your wisdom and insight with us all. So on behalf of everyone, thank you so much. We truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you again for having
Thank
me.
you, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you, Wes and Peg. And yeah, I will maybe stick around and see if there's any questions I might have missed in the chat. Put myself on mute and listen a little bit as you guys talk about the end of the book.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Peg, for making this connection so that our conversation could be possible. So,
Sure.
all right, I am going to share our screen here. And we will jump into our conversation on chapter 9 through the epilogue. And boom. So here was a quote that Robin pulled from the text, and I thought it was a great, oh crap, I forgot to say chapter 9 through the epilogue. Oh well. So Robin Wall Kimmerer stated, I want to be part of a system in which wealth means having enough to share, and where the gratification of meeting your family needs is not poisoned by destroying that possibility for someone else. And so to get us started tonight, Jamel's going to do a week 5 high-level summary. So in case you need a refresher or didn't have the chance to finish all the reading, you can kind of capture what Desmond talks about in these last few bits of the book. So take it away, Jamel.
Sure, thanks, Wes. So picking up from that quote, where we're talking about Robin Wall Kimmerer saying, your family needs, should not destroy the possibility for someone else. The big topic, in chapter 9 and the epilogue is tearing down walls, and by walls we mean segregation, and in particular segregation we often associate it with race, and class, but there's also segregation by class. And that whole notion of destroying the possibility for someone else is something that Desmond raises within the context of those who have means essentially are able to colonize the future. They can block affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. They can make sure that the educational benefits in their high opportunity schools stay there. And they're not necessarily willing to share those benefits with others. That is the type of insularity or segregation that he's talking about, that allows affluence to essentially forget about and ignore the poor. And then he talks about how we can end this type of segregation through means like integrating schools, with the high performing schools with children from other neighborhoods or from other backgrounds, ending exclusionary zoning ordinance that kind of enforce this notion of enclaves. This whole notion of how you deal with low income housing is something that he talks about as well. We talked last week about the not in my backyard phenomenon. And he basically says when low income housing is well maintained and it's allowed to blend into the surrounding community, it doesn't lower property values. He also talks about this notion of scarcity, or the creation of the view that our resources are actually scarce when they're actually not. He says, we've set up fictitious fiscal constraints. We say we can't afford to end homelessness, but we provide mortgage tax breaks to folks who don't need it as much. We can't mandate a living wage, but somehow we can tolerate corporate tax avoidance. And then we pit economic justice versus climate justice, always talking about the ways in which, because resources are scarce, we're on defense. He actually calls it the scarcity diversion playbook. He says it allows the elites to hoard a resource like money or land and pretend that that arrangement is natural or unavoidable. And then we only use the resources left over to attempt to address social problems caused by the resource hoarding. And then when our efforts fail, the blame is shifted to the government. He then talks about how we end poverty in America by lifting the floor and rebalancing our social safety net. and empowering the poor by reining in exploitation. And then he talks about the notion of poverty abolitionism. And if we're going to become anti-poverty or fight against poverty, we as individuals might need to abstain from consumer investment and workplace choices that enable poverty and economic injustice. We need to support government policies to rebalance our social safety network. We need to oppose racism and segregation and opportunity hoarding. And we need to prioritize planning over critique. In other words, if where there's a will to do things, we need to set out and do it, and not just focus on rhetorical wins, but actual wins that make sense. And that way we can help make sure that rights on paper become rights in practice. So that's a very brief overview of the topics that he has covered in the in chapter 9 and the epilogue. And in the end, like many of the authors, he challenges us to figure out what we'll do next. So I'll turn it back over to Wes.
Thank you, Jamel. Appreciate that. And so we have a quote here from page 176 in the book, where Desmond quotes James Baldwin, who stated, "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew or thought one knew, to what one possessed or dreams that one possessed." And so some truly powerful words to capture, that scarcity playbook that Matthew talks about, and the other things that Jamel did a great job on summarizing. And so let's jump into our questions. And remember, if you would like to respond, you can put your thoughts in the chat, or if you raise your Zoom hand, we'll get your mic turned on, and we would love to hear from you this evening. So, crap. Question number 1. It's a long here, there's many thoughts to it, so focus on whichever piece speaks to you, but I'll keep it here on the screen, and then we'll make sure we put it in the chat, or Jamel will put the link to the discussion guide in the chat, and you can also look at it that way. So we have many ways. So Desmond tells us that we need to tear down the walls. If I remember right, that's what chapter 9 was called, Tear Down the Walls. And in order to do that, we have to build, we have built to hoard resources for those with means, in which segregate poor communities from the rest of society. Do you agree with this notion? What walls exist within your community, and how would you benefit or suffer from them being torn down? Is there any building or piece of land in your neighborhood where you can envision successful public or affordable housing? And what do you know of town planning or zoning board meetings within your community? So keep that on for a few more seconds. And again, if you would like to respond, raise that Zoom hand feature and we'll get your mic turned on. All right, so I'm catching up to the chat here. So Steve, I think a large wall is how the ultra rich only pay 75% of taxes they owe, devising numerous methods of hoarding money which they owe to the state, offshore accounts and tax havens, defraud. John, literal geographic barriers with 2 freeways turning out neighborhood into an island. Oh yeah, that's a good one. They did it directly through a predominantly Black neighborhood here in Omaha, and right during the civil rights movement that crushed that community economically. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay, I'm outside, so I apologize for any background noise. I mentioned before the communities in the San Francisco Bay Area, at least on the west side of the bay, have a certain number of housing units they're supposed to provide. And there's an organization that tracks this sort of thing. And many of the communities are not fulfilling their housing requirements, and thereby some communities are doing all that they can. And then, as I mentioned before, one of the legislative barriers is the lack of an inclusionary clause in the zoning ordinances.
Mhm.
Those are the things that I know of, but it's I haven't kept up in the last couple of years since COVID.
Mhm. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Has anyone here ever been to, whether it's been to eviction courts, or, attended town planning zoning board meetings in their local? Looks like Rory has. Rory, would you like to speak to it? We'll get your mic turned on if you give me a thumbs up or. All right. You should. There you go. I think your mic's
There we
on.
go. I finally figured it out. Okay. Most of the town planning occurs usually on a Tuesday around 6 to 8 o'clock, and you often start seeing the same people doing there. Okay, and most of the stuff that's going on is not necessarily what would be like repurposing old homes. A lot of older folks, especially women, they lose their husband and they lose the ability to maintain their home. So the homes run down. Okay. Um, and then what happens is that home gets basically condemned. So, and they lose the wealth from that home. Okay. That's one of the ways, but that home gets redone, but not necessarily towards the same group of folks. They get what's called gentrified. Okay. And so you get a gentrification, and the older folks who are there end up being pushed out because now property taxes have increased in that area. So you see that kind of creep in to some of the older neighborhoods that you usually don't go driving down. But because I ran for office and I walk the streets, you see what's going on. Now, eviction, that's usually done in the courts. They have landlords have two ways of handling collecting the money. Okay. You can collect it monthly, in which if you collect it monthly, the tenants do have rights. But if you collect it weekly, the tenants don't have rights. Okay. And you can convict them literally in the same day. So a lot of big renting operations collect on a weekly basis to get around a lot of those tenant laws.
Well, thank you.
Does that help you any?
Yes, and I appreciate one, what you sharing, and then two, also running for office. So thank you for taking that big step to make a difference. So we appreciate it. Does anyone else have any questions here related to question one? If not, we are gonna jump to the next question. And so Jamel, I will
Sure.
let you.
So question 2 actually starts with a story that Desmond tells about how he and his wife lived in a neighborhood in Madison, Wisconsin that was a mixed community. It included people with limited means. He said that the collective community spirit was stronger there than when he moved to a more affluent suburb of Boston. He actually has a story about how people worked together to remove snow from the sidewalks. In that community in Madison, Wisconsin, they all chipped in, looking out for one another. In the more wealthy suburb of Boston, nobody helped each other with the suburb with the sidewalks. So he's talking about this in the context of, the wealth of a neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually better for living. And he raises this just in the context of trying to push back against this notion that the wealthy enclaves that we create, or the separation that we create between rich and poor, doesn't really make those who are in those wealthy communities necessarily happy. So the question is here: can you think of a time when you were in a more integrated environment and compare it with a time when you were in a non-integrated space? Just a thought to maybe share in some of the discussion today in terms of what you might have think of that anecdote that Desmond shared when we talk about trying to break down walls and push back against segregation as a means of pushing back against poverty. I'm gonna wait to see if there is a hand that comes up, with anybody who wants to share. I see Annette. I'm gonna ask you to unmute, and then Rory, I'll get to you next.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience that shortly after my divorce, I moved into an apartment complex. And I noticed that I got to know my neighbors. And I mean, to the point where one day I cut my hand and I went to the neighbor across the way, and he dropped everything to take me to the emergency room so that I could get stitched up. But as soon as I moved out of that situation, and was able to afford my own condo, I didn't have a neighbor like that. I didn't know anybody in that condo complex, not like I knew in that apartment complex. And it's just something that's always has stayed with me.
That's thank you for sharing that, Annette. And I think that's what he's getting. He's getting at how some of it is how we actually judge our wealth, and whether maybe that's part of the problem. So Rory, I'm going to ask you to unmute now.
Okay, if you look at the neighborhoods, you often look at where the porches are. Okay, now we build in segregation in our new builds. The old builds had the porches in the front, and people would sit out in front, and you would see the neighbors, okay, go for the walks, do this and that. Our new builds all have the porches in the back and gate and fences along the sides. So it's all about privacy, okay? And that builds in segregation. We don't know our neighbor because we never see them, okay? They may come and go at different hours. And so our communities are actually weaker under these new builds than in the older builds, which actually created a reason for people to see each other. You can go to different areas of a city, and if you can look and you say porches, okay, you'll see somebody sitting there, okay, and you'll say hi, and eventually you say. But if you go to the new builds, okay, you'll probably see a Ring video camera on the door, and they're basically, if you ring those Ring things, you get to say something to them, but they never answer. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. It's a good point, and part of it is thinking about how we think about this a little bit more with our eyes open in terms of the choices that we're making to to isolate. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to unmute. There you go.
Yeah, one of my favorite neighborhoods in Seattle to live in was a mixed race neighborhood, and it was mostly homeowners, and I was renting there from a homeowner who was living on the East Coast for the time being. So I don't know, like, it wasn't a typical renter's neighborhood, but yeah, it was one of my favorite neighborhoods to live in by far in Seattle. And that's why, because it was mixed race. And that's especially nice in Seattle because it has a history of coming from a more segregated place than it is now.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for sharing. And I see in the chat, Vanessa has said, I think this is in response to, some of the things that have been brought up. Vanessa says, I think times have changed. Everyone is becoming more suspicious of each other. And when we have that, we think, okay, why are we becoming more suspicious? Is the suspicion, is that part of, is that the same type of manufacturing as manufactured scarcity? Think about it, and then maybe others jump in. I'm going to ask Paula to unmute.
Hi, everyone. I'm just thinking, I currently live in a condo, which is a homeowners association. I'm way out in the suburbs of Suffolk County, close to the Hamptons. It's a beautiful place to live. But I have to say, the best way to get to know your neighbors around here, get a dog. You go out for a walk and you actually meet people, and it's a way of connecting. And one of the reasons why we choose to live in a condo is so that, we don't have to have the upkeep of, owning a home in and of itself. But I will say this, just, it is incredibly, it's not incredibly diverse. It is very sheltered. It is evolving and changing. I will say that. I've been living here 20 years. I'm seeing it change. We have more kids moving in and less older adults. But it is still, when I think about where I want to go next, I want to live in a city, a more of an urban place where I can walk to things. I can't walk to anything. I can ride my bike, but I have to drive a car 4 miles to go to a market. It's definitely not conducive. We also have zoning laws out here, which they are looking at now, where when any new builds went up for single family homes, they were on 1 acre of land. And they're looking at that and saying, okay, that wasn't a great idea. But the other piece too, and I put it in the chat early on, the zoning laws in Suffolk County, Long Island, that are run by the towns, and they are so restrictive to, if you wanted to live with unrelated people, there's laws that say you can't live with more than 3 people who are unrelated and rent a home. And that is, the purpose of that is to discourage, first of all, we have, if there's an undocumented, larger undocumented or migrant population, but also to restrict, other people of lower income. And it's so frustrating. I've been to town board meetings. We do demand change, but it's not happening. They hide behind that NIMBYism. So I'll leave it there.
Paula, that is just an excellent example of precisely what he's talking about in terms of the ways in which we are choosing that segregation. When you go to the boards and you try to set if we were to talk about the message sandwich, that we talked about last week, what would you how would you deal with somebody who said, well, we need this to keep these people out? Essentially that, they kind of acknowledge what they're doing. How'd you go about it?
Well, the last one, I didn't go personally, but I also worked for a not-for-profit agency where we sent people to represent, to speak for, and we work with a lot of people who live in poverty. It's interesting too, but anyway, we went to a meeting. As Rory was saying, they try to sneak these meetings in late at night or in the evening. They're not published. It's like a little public service announcement. They really try to hide when they are having these discussions. They know they have to have them. They have to have these meetings, these zoning board meetings. So you really need to be very vigilant. And because I worked for an organization, we were very vigilant. We would go and, because we also had housing components where we wanted to rent to more than 3 unrelated people in a house, but in a home. But we had to really challenge. And I have to say, lots of not-for-profits, lots of advocacy organizations did go and stand up. But the change I can't even begin to describe how slow it is to really crack that and make a change. But you do still have to keep showing up. So that's the best I can say, and challenge it. And hopefully there'll be incremental change. The irony of all this is they recognize they need more affordable housing to keep young, people staying instead of, leaving Long Island and moving down south or whatever. And the other piece I would say too is New York State does have very strong eviction laws, but it doesn't mean evictions don't happen. They just take longer. But they do have lots of tenant protections, but there's ways to get around them. But the biggest frustrating piece is that those zoning laws, if you want to even try to offer more affordable housing to individuals, and take homes that could use, refurbish them or whatever, and have people living there and contributing to their local communities, they can't do it. They could literally get fines, and it's another legal challenge. So I would love to know how we go about addressing and changing these ridiculous zoning laws. Discriminatory.
Well, I'll just say, you're part of to me, you're part of the solution. Just the work that you're doing. So thank you. Nelson, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then we'll probably move on after this, Wes.
Hey everyone, Nelson calling in from the San Francisco Bay Area. I have to tell you, everyone knows California is just it's on fire when it comes to our affordable housing crisis, right? We have half the nation's homeless population, more or less 300,000 people on the streets or in their cars. A real deep problem that's transpiring out here for the past decade is that the progressives kind of 10 years back in the major cities such as, LA and San Diego and San Francisco and Oakland, and San Jose, they kind of got into office and they had very stringent demands on, integration and affordable housing, right? Like if a private developer were to build a house, a multi-unit building, some of those low income requirements were up to like 25% or 30%. So what did the developers do? They ended up co-opting those progressive activists and giving them $200,000 jobs. And then what they did was they created YIMBY, right? Yes, in my backyard, but it was a dubious lobby group, right? It was actually private developers giving these, people you would normally see, fighting for Gaza or what, like a trans woman or whatever. And they would give them these $200,000 jobs and kind of front the developers. And in the process of doing that over the past 8 years, what real activists were able to fight for in terms of 25%, 30% affordable housing requirements turned to 9%. And it turned to like 11%. And in some places in Southern California, it turned to 4%. So this is a really tricky matter because whatever that contingent of people roll out in terms of like policy precedents, it gets eradicated within 5 years. The evil forces just roll in the next election cycle, they throw them all out. So, this is a very like complex matter that requires kind of a whole matrix of reforms, right? And one of them is campaign finance reform. So, throwing it out there, and I'll allow some other comments or next topic. Yeah.
Thanks, Nelson. Good points, and you're right. These issues are complex and they're connected, but we gotta start somewhere. Wes, back to you.
Yes, well, we are, great discussions here. And I kind of, I like this. Maybe perhaps it's our ending question because, we are a grassroots organizing space. And so, love that we all have chosen to be part of this discussion and have the chance to read through Desmond's book. But, Desmond describes poverty abolition as a personal and political project. And it's going to take an organized movement to truly make this happen. Those supporting labor, tenant rights, civil rights. And it's going to take a very diverse group, to truly take on this fight against poverty. And, and for some people, it is their fight, whether it's the poor, the near poor, the underprivileged, the working class, the disabled, the young, those who are comfortable, who just want justice and fairness, as, Nelson talked about those words. And so in what ways do you think the war against poverty is your fight? How might reading this book encourage you to get involved in this fight? Or how has it already encouraged you to become a poverty abolitionist? And then who else would you like to read this book? Or what are some next steps that you are already thinking about and planning to take as a result from being a part of this discussion and reading the book? So we'd love to hear from you, and whether that's in the chat or if you get your mic turned on. And I do want to give a shout out to Sarah, mentioned in the chat a couple of minutes ago, how, people staying at home and just get information from the world via TV and social media. And that has led to an increase of people being afraid and created this vicious cycle. And so, that made me think of on page 185, Desmond refers to get into relationship. And that comes from Deepak Bhargava. And so shout out, go look at page 185, because I really like that part. Get into relationship. And I think someone has their hand raised. And so Jamel, if you'll get their on, and we'll hear from them.
Sarah, I've asked you to unmute. There you go.
Hi. I just want to say that this book has been really hard for me, and I didn't even realize this. But like, I spent the whole first session that we had crying because I lived in poverty for quite a long time. And apparently I have some PTSD from it. And that I had 2 kids and a disabled husband. And I worked 3 jobs, 70 hours a week, just trying to make ends meet for a long time. And so to answer this question, I just wanted to say that the poor and the near poor, they don't have time for this. They don't have time for activism. They don't have time for, it's hard. just hard. You don't have time for anything. You don't have time to slow down. You don't have time to shower. We just gotta get up and keep going to work every day. So I just wanted to say that and say that a lot of times it's been brought up that in this country we are individualists and it's thing to take health and all that. And I had hope. I had parents who could help me, but I was too proud. I didn't want to ask for help. I thought I was an adult. I should be able to do this on my own. That's the way I was raised. Even though my parents were never guilt trip me, they offered help and whatever. I just didn't want to take it. I didn't want anybody's help. I could do it myself. And now that I'm older and I've destroyed my body from working so much, I realized that was literally done this. I used to think that was my strength, that I was getting help when I said that bullshit. That was my biggest weakness. When I take this on now, okay. Just wanted to let you guys know that I appreciate this discussion in this book a lot. You know, it was time.
Thank you for sharing, and truly appreciate, and I think that's one of the things is, for us to just be real and raw and honest, and Kara, I appreciate you doing that. And I think as we more tell our stories and our experiences and being willing to just be real with others, that's a huge first step. And so I appreciate that, Kara. And I will admit there were other parts I couldn't always catch because it kind of came across mumble. So if you wanted to summarize that, put it in the chat as well. I don't know if others had that, but at points it was a little hard to hear. Yes, so. All right. I see, Nelson put some links in the chat that we'll make sure to get put in the follow-up guide. Paula, love to have my grandsons read it. John, for me, reading the book was part of an ongoing desire to understand better to how help my neighborhood improve, especially working with the homeless. I want my city council to read the book. Ooh, what if you just, put a few copies in the mail and just send it to your city council member? I love that. So very good. All right, and Cynthia shared some folks she'll want to join with. I love it. Mary said, let's do it. Jamel, go ahead.
I think I'm inspired by Rory and Paula to figure out when the zoning board meets, and just first figure out when it meets, and then second, just show up sometime, and not necessarily with an agenda, but just to learn more about what that process is, and then feel like and maybe take somebody with me, just again, know more about it, and then when the time is right, say something. But I'm inspired by what other folks have said to actually just go and do it. And since book club is not meeting for the next few weeks, maybe I've got some time. And Kara, your notion, what you said about the people who most need it are the people who are working so hard they don't have as much time to be active, to be activists, which means those of us who do have some time need to step up, or if we can.
Any other thoughts about that? And also remember too, when it comes to being an activist, how one is an activist can look very different from another. And so as you are looking to organize your community, I'm organizing around supporting public schools right now, and just reminding folks that it takes everyone's skill set and their level of ability to give to activism, and it all looks very different. I am a proud door knocker, and I will go knock doors and do that. But that's me, and that's what I can give. But what I'm not good at doing is I'm not good at putting a piece of paper together because I'm a procrastinator. So I get things done way too late. So, we just got to realize our strengths, and then also making sure that as we are doing this work, that we're supporting ourselves and each other emotionally, mentally, spiritually, socially, because that's important. And that's one thing I love about campaigns and causes is, do they have fun in that activism, and do they provide ways for us to truly get into relationship with one another? Because as we are doing that work, it's important that we know who is that person standing side by side with me alongside that work. So, and I think Rory mentioned it, run for office. There's a lot of us who, we have a lot going on, but a big way to get these things changed is by running for office and being a new voice that is bringing these issues up. So